Hey everyone, Nupka here. We are back with another video. We have updates on this new launched video game of Spider-Man 2 and it was released on 30th January, but just a day before of the release we got the PC requirements and I didn't got the time to discuss about it and the game is launched. So before buying to this, let's read the specs and go through these specs, which is totally recommendations and appreciations to the Nixes, which has categorized with the ray tracing off and ray tracing on category. So for the minimum recommended high settings for the non-ray tracing graphics and minimum requirement for the ray tracing, which would be high, very high ultimate ray tracing. So without wasting any time, let's get to the video. So for the ray tracing off category, minimum settings we have 720p 30 fps, very low, which is a very low settings. Nvidia GTX 1650 and AMD Radeon RX 5500 XT, while Intel Core i3 8th gen and Ryzen 3 3rd gen. RAM, which is totally recommended, 16 gigs of it, and 140 gigs of SSD memory. So this game is going beyond the 100 gigs of bytes, and for that i3 is more all about this 8th gen, like 4 core and 8 threads, these kind of CPUs which we need, and it's kind of an old CPU's requirement, but we will get onto this. But the graphics card what we need here is the 1650. So the 1650, if I put the mark on this tech power up site, I can't test every graphics now because I don't have that budget. So if I put the 1650 as a 100% remarkable, so, and if I compare the same lowest settings possible with ray tracing off with the 5500 XT, so we have a 132% of spike, which is 30% more than the RX 1650, and well, you can get a more FPS on that resolution. If I move on to these recommended settings, 1080p 60 fps and medium settings. Recommended is medium settings, not even a high. So RTX 3060 and AMD RX 5700. Medium settings, which is recommended from the Nixes, and we have the RTX 3060 and AMD Radeon RX 5700, which is i5 8th gen and AMD Ryzen 3rd gen from the CPU, and 16 gigs of main memory, which is RAM, and the 140 SSD, which is normal for this game size. And if we move to the 3060 12 gigs of VRAM, if I put on this main, so for these of comparison, I think there is a less bit of comparison with that, because RX 5700 is totally lacking behind from the RTX 3060, which you can get it is 8 gigs of VRAM, while RTX 3060 is 12 gigs of VRAM. It's totally taking apart the RX 5700, which is less in a kind of an VRAM issues, while RTX 3060 has more VRAM than the RX 5700. So now we are moving up to the recommended highest settings, which is 1440p 60 fps, which is Nvidia RTX 3070 and AMD Radeon RX 6800, while from the CPU sides we have i5 11th gen and Ryzen 5 5th gen. So it is all about the 6 core 12 threads kind of CPU we require for this, because we have RTX 3070, which is 8 gigs of VRAM, while 6800 from the Radeon RX, which is it is a 16 gigs of VRAM, not the same proportions, but I think the same proportions all about the performance, but it will have a more VRAM. 3070 has 8 gigs of VRAM and also supported the DLSS, while 6800 RX 6800X, which does not have a DLSS support, but still you can get a kind of an FSR and all this thing upscaling, so you can totally take advantages. So I think 3070 and RX 6800, which kind of give you the high performance settings, which is fair enough. And if I move on to the RTX on category, we have a high ray tracing, very high ray tracing, and ultimate ray tracing. So high ray tracing 1440p 60 fps if you wanted to turn on the RTX on for the high settings, and graphic settings will be the high, and ray tracing will also be high. So it's always from the high settings. So we have an RTX 4070. So if I go to these RTX 4070 series, which is 22% more than RTX 3070, but I think this is not gonna give you the much more performance because RTX 3070 is 82%, while RTX 4070 is 100%. If I set to the 100, it is more like 20%, so you can get few FPS, but I think there's bit of more nuance to these graphics settings, but I don't believe that RTX 3070 and RTX 4070 can pull off much more in a RTX core, but you have 12 gigs of VRAM, so I suppose you can pull off that. While we have from this AMD Radeon RX 7900 XT, which you can pull off some FPS. So there will be an RX 7900 XT. There is an RX 7900 XT which is 24 gigs of VRAM, so you can pull off these 40% extra from the RTX 4070, which is totally a worth deal, I can say. You can have 40% extra, so more FPS you can get in the RTX 4070. You can get more rasterizations and even raw performance with the RTX from Radeon. So that's a pretty good performance increase. While the Intel iCore i5 11th Gen 600K is required, which will be more than 8 cores, 16 threads is kind of CPUs, and AMD Radeon Ryzen 5 5600X. So these CPU needs more performance while not making it a bottleneck. So if you wanted to go for the very high ray tracing with the 1440p 60 fps, the graphics will be setting to high, but ray tracing will set to very high. So RX 4080 and Radeon RX 7900 XTX. So if you go for the RTX 4080, so 4080 we have normally 16 gigs of VRAM, while 7900 and XTX, which we have a 24 gigs of VRAM. So if I set the 4080 at the 100%, you will get 102% because it can have a more VRAM, but the performance wise it can pull off the same. And I think the RTX 4080, it's quite a bit of the same prices for the RX 7900 XTX, and bit of more but less than a RTX 4090. So these are the games for the 4040p competitors graphics card, and it can pull off few more FPS definitely, but we have a more VRAM, so 7900 XTX can stay longer for the upcoming games, which can have 24 gigs of VRAM, so it can stay longer and run every games smoothly. So if I move to the ultimate ray tracing, which is 4K 60 FPS, graphics will be very high and ray tracing will be on ultimate settings. We have a RTX 4090 straightforward, so this is the straightforward RTX 4090, and we have not even any sort of graphics cards coming towards this. And you can get RTX 7900 XTX still you can get, which is 20% less, but for the RTX 4090 perspective, it is a pretty high graphic performance on graphics card, so you can pull off this all. Whilst from the CPU size, you will get the i9 12th Gen 900K, while AMD Radeon 7 7800X 3D. So you need a 3D cache and not get any sort of bottlenecking because you are using RTX 4090. So you need to get this kind of performance by the CPU to avoid any sort of bottlenecking. So you still need a VRAM 32 gigs because of the ultimate ray tracing for 4K 60 FPS, while everything will be the same. So these kind of high graphics demandings, but still game is crashing. There is a problem, and the patches will be coming up soon enough or not. Let's wait. Once it get patched up and all the stuffs, we get all the reviews and all, then it will be worthwhile to buy and not buy. That's totally upon the customers and you. So that's it for my side. I'll bring back the new videos and updates on the regarding games. Thank you for watching this video. I'll meet you in the next. So till then, keep gaming. Nupkasob out.
Yeah, boy.